Hi, everyone. My name is SHIN Haerin, and I'm a professor of media studies at Korea University. It is a genuine pleasure and privilege to be here, and I will wrap up quickly because I do realize this is part of the last session of the day, and you must all be really tired after long 2 days. And I'm also excited to see that the previous two presentations focused more on the content and industry of webtoons or manhwa or comics as a whole, because today in my presentation, I'm more interested in thinking about the mechanism of webtoons and its medium specificity. I do want to emphasize that I am looking at webtoons in connection to their adaptations in drama form, and in the course of doing so, I do also want to emphasize the fact that webtoons, as I see it, have so much in common, not only within the lineage of comics, but also the medium of cinema, or rather moving images. As you all know, Korean drama has achieved major feats over the past several months or perhaps the past year. But Squid Game did not just happen overnight. In fact, there were so many other dramas that preceded Squid Game, which kind of anticipated the rise of Korean drama to the attention of the globe. And these would count as some of the examples topping the chart on Netflix alone. And also, in fact, the interesting thing about the dramas that I just shared is that they are all uniformly adaptations of original webtoons. But also, leading up to their becoming prominent, there were many Korean dramas that did become popular before the resurgence of Hallyu and all that, which were, in fact, webtoon adaptations as well. As you can see, just 4 out of many other examples, a great number of them accentuate the fact that they are webtoon adaptations, placing weight on what's called the sync rate, as we say it in Korea, synchro율. This is in turn showing that there's more to this unique combination of webtoons and drama as in live action moving image, not just film, but also animation, any form of moving image. More than just cross-media, but also a clear awareness and emphasis on medium specificity. And I do believe that webtoons, and again, its coalition of their adaptations in drama form has much to do with this interesting space between and beyond cross-media adaptations and transmedia ecologies. And by transmedia here, I am indeed referring to transmedia storytelling, which in media studies refers to the practice of expanding world building through the coalition of various media. Picking up where one medium left off or branching out hypertextually, transmedia storytelling mobilizes medium specificity to create an ecology of the varied elements that constitute a narrative. Japan's media ecology, as we all know, counting as a case in point with light novels, manga, anime, feature animation in theaters, TV movies, OVAs, TV series, film adaptations, games, and the list goes on. These different media are mobilized to expand on and continue and even branch out from an existing world. And not only in Japan, but obviously in various places, MCU being also a case in point in the US, but even before MCU, of course, we had Star Wars with fan fiction, novels, and little toys and figurines, the industry galore. So the webtoon drama ecology, as I see it, is a kind of remediation, that of not only content and form, but the medium itself. Bolter and Grusin's remediation, and the concept emphasizes that the old and new come into play together, which is in essence always an intermediation as well, such as Netflix revamping TV, but also changing the practice and experience of cinema, making it more akin to, for instance, theme park attractions, as Tom Gunning would have it. The Korean webtoon drama ecology shows how the mobile medium changed the comics medium, and in turn, how the newly emergent medium of webtoons is invoking the mechanism of analog cinema. The interesting thing here is that this transition from print comics to webtoons, which were already discussed in the preceding presentation, occurred with clear cognizance of and intentful capitalization on the medium specificity of mobile new media, and to be even more specific, the contemporary iteration of smartphones and its vertical scroll feature. I lay emphasis on the meta element, the prefix meta referring to an awareness of mechanism itself. Whereas cross-media instrumentalization instrumentalizes to enrich an existing narrative, transmedia mobilizes medium specificity to expand a narrative. Uniformly, medium specificity is derivative in both cases. But in the case of Webtoon drama ecology in Korea, we see medium specificity determining and changing the narrative itself, a flip in the dynamic. Not assistant, but the protagonist, with conscious acknowledgement of the mechanism of medium, which is why I call this meta-mediation. So, obviously, the emergence of Webtoon has so much to do with, again, the rise of the mobile environment, not only in terms of how this medium mobile environment and the terminals are housed by specific hardware, but powered by its networked nature as a new media, but also in the sense that the medium of comics not as a form, but a medium, has evolved in accordance with such conditions. Medium within and through media, not genre or form. This is a short clip from a talk that Scott McCloud, a prominent comics scholar, gave quite a few years ago. And he comes up with the idea of the infinite canvas. The infinite canvas involves the notion that with the advent of digital media, in his case PCs, because this idea is in fact dated, has changed the way in which we engage with comics. The terminal itself is a frame through which we view other frames, but in an expansive manner, so that we don't only have to look at comics as a succession of frames, but see them as a wide, spread out space that we can navigate and look over. But I do find it interesting that this earlier understanding of the advent of digital media and the combination of that with comics has more to do with space than movement. Because as I see it, Webtoons have so much to do with movement, more so than the idea of space. And in discussing these changes, incumbents, I'm not only talking about Korea, because of course the rise of mobile terminal use has been uniformly all around the globe as a phenomenon, but in Korea in particular, that has been most prominent because early adaptations and, of course, powered by the nationwide installation of high-speed internet. And I brought some figures that show how the younger generation of our time is very much about mobile media rather than PCs. Changes in the demographics of internet and mobile terminal use. And in turn, another reason why Webtoons appear to be more prominent in Korea, because of course a lot of different countries have a very robust and rich history of comics. It has much to do with how mobile platforms grabbed onto the rise of mobile younger generation use and decided to create specific and customized platforms that capitalize on mobile customized UI and UX. And we did hear a lot about specific works of Webtoons yesterday through Mr. Romance, and I'm sure you saw in the news that there are all these different Webtoon platforms that have very specific characteristics. For instance, Talum, the readership is older in terms of age, maybe around my age, and they focus more on well-crafted narratives, whereas Naver is more geared toward a wider audience, but then that is kind of a double-edged sword because that means the quality of the narratives are often not guaranteed. And then we have Resin Comics, which allows for a greater variety of different genre fiction. And of course, there's Kakao Story, the list goes on. But another interesting phenomenon we observe in early Webtoons that became popular and the ones that are these days adapted into drama form is that the greater majority of them revolve around genre fiction grammar, about which I will shortly discuss further. And because we don't have much time, and also since we heard a lot about the history of comics, I'm going to skip over this part. But Webtoons are deeply also rooted in the history of manhwa in Korea. For instance, how in the earlier days we had this thing called daebonso. I don't know if anyone's been to one. It's just kind of not really pleasant, smelly, kind of old feel place where they have rows and rows of books, and you go to quote unquote escape into a marginal genre that your parents tell you not to engage with. But then we move on to the magazine culture, print comics becoming more prominent with Korea's economic rise and democratization, and trends begin to change. So these days we have manhwa cafes, which are pretty fancy, and this would be Webtoon, another example of how manhwa culture has really now come into the sun in different ways. But back to digital media. So not just about mobility in terms of how we understand the rise of Webtoons. I believe that there is a great significance to be laid upon the mobile terminal and its specificity as the mechanism and the force and the frame that undergirds the way in which Webtoons work. The body of the medium, I'd like to emphasize, has much to do with the smartphone's touchscreen and its scroll function, which is very much, again, about not space, but movement. Gilles Deleuze, in his idea of movement image, emphasizes the idea of shots as a component-based unit of cinema. In doing so, he highlights the movement of the camera, not just the film roll, the hardware through which the medium of film is in turn created, not movement of the story, narrative, the content, but again, the hardware. The mobility of mobile media in this sense has much to do with how we can use the medium, smartphones, not in situ, but en route to somewhere. Also in the sense that the medium itself, smartphone, demands and exists through movement, namely scrolling and touching. Whereas the idea that the movement is something crucial, I think has two dimensions. For instance, that the mobile terminal is literally mobile. We can carry it around and use it while moving around. That has much to do with Deleuze's emphasis on camera as in the importance of hardware and the environment it creates. But I also find the second element really important, as in how the medium encased in the hardware itself moves. So the film roll and its mechanism, not only as remediation, but how the new media invokes and transforms old media. Here we see precisely that. For instance, Webtoon, seen from this perspective, is not necessarily a juxtaposition and serialization of still frames, but it is moving image, because Webtoons do not happen and they do not exist unless the user is scrolling, unless the user makes it actually happen. So even in terms of content, the idea of mobility is really key because that has to do with genre fiction, or what I call intermittent bursts of information usage and consumption that has become the general norm in contemporary media use modality. People move around. If you go on the subway in the morning or in the evening, everybody's watching something on their cell phones, especially in Korean subways. Sadly, nobody appears to be reading print books. Not that I do, and I'm contrite to say. But still, again, because they can't really pay much attention and devote focused attention to what is on the screen, the consumption pattern revolves, or rather veers more towards two intermittent bursts. For instance, in the process of scrolling down and moving, something that catches your attention, you stop and you look into it. But then otherwise, there is constant scrolling. The interesting thing is Webtoons very actively and consciously capitalize on that kind of modality. So, subways. And even the make and craft of Webtoons, in fact, very much align with that kind of consumption pattern, because if you look at the Webtoon industry, there actually is a huge business providing background graphics for Webtoons. So unlike in the past, Webtoon creators don't necessarily, quote unquote, waste or spend too much time in creating the backgrounds. The creation of Webtoons has become modulated in terms of putting different elements together in a modular fashion. And the curious thing is modularity is the absolute lifeblood of digital media, as in being able to combine and put together, but also put back and consume as discrete pieces different media elements that we engage with. And so I also find interesting that the readers take on the active role of propelling the movement, as noted before, making the medium happen. This applies to any medium, one might say. Print comics in particular, Marshall McLuhan went so far as to define comics, print comics, as cold media, meaning one has to exert agency to make the medium happen. Fill in the blanks, the noise between moments, the gutters, blank space between the frames. You have to fill it in with your own imagination. You have to turn the pages. Even the same deal with written fiction. But the difference between print comics and webtoons, I believe, is that this agential involvement in the case of webtoons is substantive. You don't do it conceptually. You actually have to do stuff with your body, and that physicality is absolutely key. As in game studies scholars such as Galloway or Ian Bogost notes, game media is distinctive in that players actually have to physically do stuff. They have to press the buttons. They have to toggle the joystick. And the way in which that physical exertion becomes part and parcel of the medium's existence and its own lived experience, I believe, is key to understanding the way in which webtoons operate as, again, emblematic instances of what I call compression culture. So the compressed nature of webtoons, as in this case, compressed by this I mean discrete modular information, aspects of which you can freely and speed up and scroll through and only consume in selective manner, is perfectly in line with the manner in which we consume mobile new media and how that has changed the way in which we cognize information as a whole. The engagement pattern with moving images as a whole as well. One of the reasons why webtoon adaptations have been successful in terms of their sync rate or synchro율, but how webtoons based on K-drama effectively appeals not just to Koreans, but also the new media generation, young generation as a whole, I believe has much to do with precisely this. We were, over the past 2 days, talking much about short form, intermittent bursts of consumption, or the move, TikTok and Instagram over, for instance, Facebook. My students tell me Facebook has too much text, and I would agree, not that text is bad. Must say up to date, and there is this constant fear of falling behind, what is called the FOMO syndrome, fear of missing out, and the inundation of information. Just looking at students, but everyone in general, there is just so much information out there. It is hard to sift through them and understand what is necessary to stay in vogue. And hence, we have this term snack culture. And I think the way in which it could be understood is a kind of digest culture, or rather, sampling culture. Even when watching series, like a drama series or serialized webtoons, preferring digests on YouTube, most of my students, they prefer to watch digests on YouTube, 요약본, instead of 정주행. So these 요약본s or summaries are very interestingly spiced up with commentaries because the people who create these digests, they interpret and reinterpret and recurate these different elements based on notable shots rather than the overall arc of the narrative. And also, people these days, if you have a long, rather boring content, what do? They speed it up. Even dramas that do require focused attention, oftentimes what happens is people speed up. I do that all the time. But they can also freely stop and slow down at key moments, key shots. So again, more in the unit of shots based on movement rather than freeze frames. So I am going to skip over and conclude at this point. Actually, I'm already done. So again, my objective in thinking of webtoons as emblematic of the digital new media age and its consumption pattern, but also the way in which media and we interact with each other is not to make a value judgment, not an axiological statement in the sense that these days people consume texts in an intermittent burst manner, compression culture as in loss of information, because given the mechanism of digital media, compression always does entail certain losses of information. But I also see that as a creative space to be filled in and expanded by users, because if you look at the so-called summaries on YouTube, that is precisely what is happening. So again, apart from value judgment, I do believe that the interesting ecology and interaction and also symbiosis we see in Korean webtoons and their drama adaptations is demonstrative of how we understand media and we change it, also how media change us. And I think it's exciting to see where this would go in the future. And yeah, thank you so much for listening. Thank you.